A solitary, serrated tooth emerges from the cracked limestone of a barren desert cliff. Millions of years ago, this very rock was the floor of a thriving, vibrant ocean. Now, all that remains of that lost world is a singular, petrified fragment of a predator. How does a biological lineage outlive the very oceans that birthed it? What exact mechanisms allow a creature to witness the seas boil, the skies rain burning ash, and the global food webs collapse, yet emerge into the next epoch completely intact? The giant marine reptiles, those seemingly invincible leviathans of the prehistoric deep, all eventually turned to dust. Yet a lineage that began as a humble, toothless bottom dweller outlasted them all, surviving 4 out of the 5 mass extinction events in Earth history. Science has recently begun to piece together the fossilized clues, revealing a terrifying perfection of anatomical design. It is not a story of sheer brute force, but a saga of microscopic adjustments, metabolic efficiency, and an evolutionary blueprint that thrives in the wake of global devastation. Welcome to Prehistoric Entertainment. If the dark, ancient mysteries of our planet and the evolution of its most formidable survivors fascinate you, subscribe to our channel to journey back through the eons. The answers lie deep within a legacy of survival that spans hundreds of millions of years, challenging our fundamental understanding of dominance. What hidden advantages did a skeleton completely devoid of rigid bone provide when the global oceans turned toxic and acidic? How did a vulnerable underdog of the primordial mud systematically upgrade its sensory biology into a hunting machine so flawless that 4 separate global apocalypses could not erase it from existence? The ocean of the Ordovician period, approximately 450 million years ago, was an alien environment dominated by biological architectures that would be unrecognizable today. The apex predators of this era did not possess backbones. Giant orthoconic cephalopods, some encasing themselves in rigid conical shells measuring over 20 feet in length, patrolled the upper water columns. Beneath them, massive sea scorpions known as eurypterids, heavily armored arthropods equipped with formidable crushing appendages, ruled the shallow benthic zones. In this primordial hierarchy, the early ancestors of modern sharks were entirely insignificant. The fossil record from this period does not reveal the terrifying predators of popular lore. Rather, it yields isolated, microscopic fragments. Paleontologists have recovered tiny, tooth-like structures scattered within sedimentary rock, identifying them as the earliest iterations of placoid scales. These isolated microfossils belong to creatures that were no larger than modern minnows, dwelling quietly in the muddy, unlit fringes of the ocean floor. To understand the survival of this lineage, one must first dismantle the modern perception of what a shark is and analyze the anatomical reality of its earliest precursors. These proto-sharks lacked one critical piece of biological machinery. They did not possess jaws. They were agnathans, relying on simple, circular, muscular mouths to sift through the sediment, filtering zooplankton, or consuming decaying organic matter that drifted down from the productive waters above. They could not hunt, they could not bite, and they possessed no capacity to inflict traumatic injury upon other organisms. Their entirely defense-focused anatomy was encapsulated by their skin. The placoid scales, also known as dermal denticles, are a marvel of bioengineering that appeared remarkably early in their evolutionary history. Unlike the flat, overlapping scales of typical bony fish, placoid scales are structurally homologous to teeth. Each microscopic scale consists of a central pulp cavity supplied with blood vessels, surrounded by a layer of dentin, and capped with a hard, enameloid substance. While modern sharks utilize these denticles to manipulate fluid dynamics and reduce hydrodynamic drag for silent, high-speed swimming, the early Ordovician precursors likely developed them as a rudimentary, flexible chainmail. This microscopic armor provided a crucial defense mechanism against the abrasive sand of the ocean floor and the crushing mandibles of predatory invertebrates, all without sacrificing bodily flexibility. It is an anatomical strategy that prioritizes resilience over aggression. The utility of this passive survival strategy was violently tested 443 million years ago during the Ordovician Silurian mass extinction event, the first of the 5 major biological annihilations in Earth history. The mechanics of this extinction were driven by severe and rapid geological climatic shifts. The supercontinent Gondwana drifted over the southern pole, triggering a massive global glaciation event. As colossal ice sheets formed, they locked up vast quantities of the planet's water. Global sea levels plummeted drastically, draining the shallow epicontinental seas that house the vast majority of marine biodiversity. Habitats simply vanished into dry land, while the remaining oceans experienced a catastrophic drop in temperature. Furthermore, the disruption in global ocean circulation patterns led to widespread anoxia, stripping the water of life-sustaining oxygen. This sequence of atmospheric and oceanic failures eradicated approximately 85% of all marine species. The colossal orthocones and the heavily armored sea scorpions suffered catastrophic losses. Their dominant status was an evolutionary trap. Being apex predators, their sheer size required massive, continuous caloric intake to sustain their complex biological systems and heavy biological armor. The glaciation suppressed sunlight penetration and altered water chemistry, causing the rapid die-off of phytoplankton, which formed the base of the marine food web. The resultant collapse rippled upwards with devastating speed. The giant predators starved, their rigid, heavy bodies becoming useless liabilities in an ocean devoid of adequate prey and oxygen. Conversely, the jawless, bottom-dwelling Proto-Sharks survived. Their survival was not a product of strength, but a calculation of metabolic economics. Because they were small, their baseline caloric requirements were infinitesimally low compared to the apex predators. Furthermore, their position as benthic detritivores effectively insulated them from the immediate shock waves of the food web collapse. Even as the organisms in the upper water column died en masse, their decaying organic matter sank to the ocean floor, ironically providing a steady, albeit grim, food supply for those adapted to feed on detritus. Paleontological logic dictates that organisms relying on the very bottom of the food chain, consuming the remnants of the dead rather than hunting the living, possess a distinct statistical advantage during sudden, catastrophic ecological transitions. Additionally, their lack of massive, rigid, bony armor proved highly beneficial during this climatic upheaval. Synthesizing heavy calcium carbonate shells or dense, armored exoskeletons requires an immense expenditure of cellular energy and precise, stable ocean chemistry. As the Ordovician oceans cooled and chemical compositions fluctuated, maintaining such structures became metabolically exhausting. The shark ancestors, utilizing lightweight, pliable dermal denticles and an internal cartilaginous precursor structure, bypassed this heavy physiological tax. Cartilage is an avascular tissue. It lacks internal blood vessels and grows much slower than bone, significantly reducing the energy required to maintain the organism's structural integrity. In a freezing, dying ocean where energy was the most precious and scarce commodity, the weak, jawless mud dwellers possessed the perfect biological profile for outlasting the apocalypse. The fossil evidence presents a stark contrast between the absolute vulnerability of an organism during stable periods and its profound resilience during a global crisis. The massive predators that had terrorized the Ordovician seas left nothing behind but calcified husks entombed in stone, their lineages abruptly truncated. Meanwhile, the microscopic placoid scales continued to appear in the subsequent sedimentary layers of the early Silurian period, indicating that this unassuming lineage had quietly navigated through the freezing darkness. They emerged into a newly empty, slowly warming ocean, a desolate world wiped clean of their former oppressors. The evolutionary slate had been wiped blank, and the humble survivors of the benthic mud were now positioned in an environment completely devoid of major competition. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction did not destroy the proto-shark. It inadvertently removed the biological ceiling that had suppressed its evolution, opening millions of years of vacant ecological niches and setting the stage for one of the most significant anatomical transformations in the history of vertebrate life. The Devonian period, commencing approximately 419 million years ago, is universally recognized within the geological timescale as the Age of Fishes. It was an era defined by a massive evolutionary radiation within the global oceans, transforming the previously quiet marine environments into violently competitive ecosystems. The humble mud-dwelling ancestors of the shark had survived the freezing starvation of the previous epoch, but the warming Devonian seas presented a completely different type of existential threat: the proliferation of giant, armored predators. To survive in this new, hyper-competitive biological theater, the early shark lineage underwent an anatomical revolution that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of vertebrate history. The jawless agnathans were severely limited by their anatomy. They could only consume what they could swallow whole or passively filter from the water column, capping their maximum size and ecological influence. The solution to this biological ceiling was the evolution of the hinged jaw, a masterpiece of anatomical repurposing. The prevailing scientific hypothesis, supported by modern comparative embryology and the fossil record, dictates that jaws did not spontaneously generate out of genetic thin air. They were mechanically adapted from pre-existing structures. In jawless fishes, the delicate gill slits are held open and supported by a series of sequential, cartilaginous rods known as branchial arches. Through millions of years of microscopic genetic mutations and relentless environmental pressure, the first and second pairs of these branchial arches slowly migrated forward toward the oral cavity. They enlarged, developed a sophisticated central hinge mechanism, and transformed into the palatoquadrate, which serves as the upper jaw and Meckel's cartilage, which forms the lower mandible. This transition from passive branchial support to an active mechanical lever is arguably the most significant anatomical upgrade in the history of animal life. A hinged jaw equipped with teeth allowed an organism to actively manipulate its environment. It permitted creatures to grasp struggling prey, tear flesh into digestible fragments, and consume organisms significantly larger than their own oral opening. This single mechanical adaptation unlocked vast new reservoirs of protein and fat, providing the necessary caloric fuel for increased body size, higher swimming speeds, and expanded neurological processing. However, the early sharks were not the only creatures to develop this devastating biological weaponry. The Devonian oceans were absolutely dominated by a class of heavily armored fishes known as placoderms. These creatures represent the absolute extreme of defensive and offensive biological engineering. The most infamous among them, such as the colossal Dunkleosteus, reached lengths exceeding 20 feet and weighed over a ton. Placoderms did not merely have jaws. They possessed massive, self-sharpening bony plates extending from their skulls that functioned as hydraulic shears, capable of generating bite forces strong enough to snap a prehistoric shark in half. Their entire heads and thoracic regions were encased in thick, articulated dermal bone, transforming them into impregnable biological dreadnoughts. They were the undisputed apex predators of the Devonian pelagic zones, dominating through sheer brute force and impenetrable defense. Faced with such overwhelming physical superiority, the primitive sharks were forced to adopt an entirely different evolutionary strategy. While the placoderms invested all their physiological resources into heavy calcified armor and massive bone structures, the ancestors of modern sharks committed to a completely divergent architectural path. They retained and perfected a skeleton made entirely of cartilage. This defines the taxonomic class Chondrichthyes. For decades, early paleontologists debated whether this cartilaginous framework was a primitive evolutionary leftover, assuming that sharks simply had not yet evolved the ability to grow true bone. Modern paleobiological analysis has thoroughly dismantled this assumption. Ancestral fossil evidence indicates that the earliest precursors to sharks did possess rudimentary bone tissues, meaning the transition to a purely cartilaginous skeleton was not a failure to evolve, but a highly specific, active secondary adaptation. They genetically discarded their heavy bony armor in favor of a specialized cartilaginous matrix, because cartilage provided a suite of hidden mechanical and metabolic advantages that rigid bone could never offer. To understand this advantage, one must consider the physics of the marine environment. Water is 800 times denser than air, and true bone is an exceedingly dense, heavy material. A massive bony predator, like a placoderm, must constantly expend immense amounts of muscular energy merely to counteract gravity and prevent itself from sinking into the abyssal depths. Sharks engineered a completely different hydrodynamic solution. Cartilage is approximately half the density of calcified bone. By constructing their entire structural framework from this lightweight material, prehistoric sharks drastically reduced their overall specific gravity. When combined with the subsequent evolutionary development of a massive lipid-rich liver to provide static buoyancy, the cartilaginous skeleton allowed sharks to maintain their position in the water column with a fraction of the energetic cost required by their armored rivals. Furthermore, cartilage possesses extraordinary viscoelastic properties. It can deform under intense mechanical stress and snap back to its original shape without suffering structural failure. A heavily armored placoderm swam with the rigid, cumbersome mechanics of a submarine, requiring a massive turning radius. Conversely, an early cartilaginous shark could flex its entire body with a fluid, whip-like grace, granting it unparalleled agility and the ability to execute incredibly tight turns to outmaneuver heavier, slower predators. Beyond the immediate physics of movement, the most profound advantage of cartilage lies in the invisible realm of metabolic economics. True bone is a highly vascularized living tissue that demands a relentless, continuous supply of calcium, phosphorus, oxygen, and metabolic energy to grow, maintain its density, and repair cellular microfractures. In stark contrast, cartilage is largely avascular, meaning it lacks a dedicated internal blood supply, relying instead on the slow, efficient diffusion of nutrients from surrounding bodily fluids. Consequently, constructing and maintaining a cartilaginous skeleton requires a drastically lower baseline of caloric overhead. In the hyper-competitive, dangerous oceans of the Devonian period, this metabolic efficiency was a silent, decisive weapon. While the massive placoderms were forced into a perpetual, exhausting hunt to fuel the immense energy demands of their heavy bony armor and massive bodies, the early sharks could survive on significantly fewer calories. They could hunt with greater agility, travel longer distances with less effort, and allocate a much larger percentage of their caloric intake toward reproduction and the development of advanced sensory organs. The Devonian oceans thus became the testing ground for two diametrically opposed survival philosophies. On one side stood the placoderms, relying on the sheer, undeniable power of heavy calcified bone, impenetrable armor, and devastating bite force. On the other side lurked the early sharks, stripped of all heavy defenses, betting their entire evolutionary existence on lightweight flexibility, metabolic efficiency, and the mechanical advantage of a cartilaginous frame. The apex predators of the era appeared invincible, projecting an illusion of permanent biological supremacy. Yet, beneath the surface, the true metric of long-term survival is not found in absolute strength or impenetrable armor, but in the subtle, unseen efficiency of biological design, an efficiency that would soon be tested by another catastrophic shift in the fundamental chemistry of the planet. The late Devonian period, cresting toward its catastrophic conclusion approximately 359 million years ago, was about to demonstrate the lethal cost of evolutionary overspecialization. The magnificent placoderms, clad in their impenetrable armor, possessed an undisputed monopoly on the upper echelons of the marine food web, while the early sharks continued to operate quietly in the metabolic margins. However, evolutionary supremacy is entirely conditional, dictated by the stability of the environment, and when the Earth underwent a dramatic terrestrial transformation, the oceans were subjected to a slow, suffocating death known as the late Devonian mass extinction. This cataclysm encompassed a series of devastating, prolonged pulses, most notably the Kellwasser and the Hangenberg events. The catalyst for this biological apocalypse did not originate from the cosmos, but from the very continents that were rising above the seas. For the first time in planetary history, deep-rooted vascular plants and vast, complex forests began to colonize the terrestrial land masses on a massive scale. This rapid botanical explosion fundamentally altered the global carbon cycle and accelerated silicate weathering, drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide and triggering severe episodes of global cooling. More insidiously, the extensive root systems of these primordial forests systematically broke down continental rock, releasing unprecedented quantities of terrestrial nutrients, primarily phosphorus and nitrogen, directly into the global river systems. This massive continuous nutrient runoff poured into the shallow, sunlit epicontinental seas, triggering a catastrophic sequence of events known as global marine eutrophication. The sudden influx of biological fertilizer caused explosive, unnatural algal blooms on the ocean's surface, blocking out the sunlight. As these trillions of short-lived algae died and sank into the depths, their bacterial decomposition consumed colossal quantities of dissolved oxygen, creating vast, expanding dead zones of toxic, anoxic water. In these oxygen-starved depths, anaerobic bacteria thrived, producing deadly hydrogen sulfide gas that bubbled upward, further poisoning the marine column. Simultaneously, the shifting global climate led to severe fluctuations in sea levels and a dramatic disruption of ocean chemistry, directly impacting the massive reef systems. The Devonian reefs, constructed not just by modern corals, but by extinct, massive groups of sponges known as stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, were the biological engines of the ancient oceans. They housed the vast, complex food webs that sustained the massive apex predators. As the waters became acidic, murky, and completely devoid of oxygen, these majestic reef systems suffered a total global collapse. This environmental disintegration laid bare the fatal flaw in the placoderms' evolutionary strategy. The heavy, articulated dermal bone that made creatures like Dunkleosteus invincible in combat became an insurmountable physiological burden. Bone is a highly active, metabolically expensive living tissue. It requires continuous internal remodeling driven by cellular mechanisms that demand immense oxygen and constant nutrient uptake. To maintain a massive, heavily armored body, a placoderm required an uninterrupted, staggering intake of calories. Furthermore, the synthesis of their enormous bony plates demanded immense quantities of calcium and stable ocean chemistry, both of which were rapidly deteriorating. When the reefs died, the complex food web shattered. The colossal prey items that fueled the placoderms vanished almost overnight. Suddenly, their impenetrable armor transformed from a definitive biological advantage into a heavy, calcified anchor, dragging them into the suffocating depths. They were starving, struggling to navigate an oxygen-depleted ocean while carrying the dead weight of their own skeletal structure. The placoderm lineage, unable to adapt their highly specialized, energy-intensive bodies to the rapidly deteriorating ecosystem, suffered a complete and total annihilation. Not a single placoderm survived the Devonian period. In stark contrast, the catastrophic collapse of the oceanic food web validated the alternative evolutionary path chosen by the early sharks. The very anatomical features that had rendered them the underdogs of the Devonian seas now became the ultimate mechanism for survival. Their cartilaginous skeletons, completely devoid of heavy, calcium-demanding bone, proved to be an act of profound evolutionary foresight. Cartilage requires remarkably little metabolic energy to maintain, and its formation is far less dependent on the precise calcium carbonate saturation states that were rapidly fluctuating in the acidic, dying oceans. Cartilage does not undergo the constant, energy-draining cellular remodeling that true bone requires, effectively lowering the overall biological maintenance cost of the organism. Because they lacked the immense weight of biological armor, the sharks possessed a significantly lower baseline metabolic rate. They required only a fraction of the caloric intake needed by their armored counterparts. When the great reefs crumbled and the large, energy-dense prey items disappeared, the sharks were not condemned to starvation. Their high maneuverability, coupled with their low energy requirements, allowed them to scavenge efficiently. They could subsist on the decaying remnants of the dying ecosystem, or hunt the smaller, highly elusive, surviving marine organisms that were too fast and energetically costly for a starving, heavy placoderm to pursue. Paleontologists hypothesize that the early sharks also possessed a wider physiological tolerance for fluctuating oxygen levels and extreme temperature variations, a direct byproduct of their unspecialized, highly adaptable biology. While the highly specialized placoderms were genetically locked into a massive, energy-draining biological design that doomed them, the early sharks were perfectly optimized for an era of profound scarcity. They could afford to wait in the shadows while the biological titans of their era suffocated and starved. The late Devonian extinction events served as a brutal, indiscriminate filter, systematically eliminating organisms that required massive, uninterrupted resource inputs. The fossil record clearly illustrates the undeniable outcome of this metabolic filtering. The formidable bone plates of the placoderms vanish entirely from the geological strata, leaving no descendants, completely replaced by an increasing abundance of fossilized cartilaginous shark teeth and dermal denticles in the subsequent sedimentary layers. The second major mass extinction did not merely spare the shark lineage, it actively weaponized their inherent metabolic efficiency, proving that in a volatile, unpredictable universe, biological flexibility and low energy requirements are infinitely more valuable than sheer physical dominance. By the time the ocean stabilized and the Hangenberg event concluded, the grand biological experiment of the armored fishes had definitively failed. The slate had been wiped clean once again. The early sharks emerged from the toxic, suffocating gloom of the Devonian period, not merely as fortunate survivors, but as the sole inheritors of the global marine environment. The apex predator niches, permanently vacated by the extinction of the placoderms, lay completely open and uncontested, setting the stage for an explosive radiation of bizarre anatomical designs and ushering in an era where the descendants of the muddy bottom dwellers would finally rise to absolute dominance, unchecked by armored rivals and ready to test the very limits of their biological engineering. The dawn of the Carboniferous period, initiating approximately 359 million years ago, unveiled a planetary environment utterly transformed by the preceding apocalyptic events. The vast, heavily armored placoderms that had monopolized the oceanic hierarchy were entirely erased from the fossil record, leaving behind a profound ecological vacuum. Nature inherently abhors a vacuum, and the complete absence of apex biological competitors provided the surviving cartilaginous lineages with an unprecedented opportunity for expansion. The continents, drifting slowly across the globe, created immense, shallow epicontinental seas that were bathed in sunlight and superheated by the equatorial climate. Simultaneously, the massive explosion of terrestrial rainforests pumped unprecedented volumes of oxygen into the atmosphere, which subsequently dissolved into the oceans, creating a highly oxygenated, nutrient-rich marine environment that functioned as a global biological incubator. Under these mathematically perfect conditions for accelerated evolution, the Chondrichthyan genetic code was liberated from the suppressive survival pressures of the Devonian. The early sharks were no longer relegated to the shadowy fringes of the benthic mud. They ascended boldly into the pelagic zones. What followed is classified by paleontologists as the first golden age of sharks, a period characterized not by the refinement of a single, highly efficient predatory design, but by an explosive, chaotic radiation of bizarre, almost alien anatomical morphologies. Because their skeletal architecture was constructed entirely of cartilage rather than rigid, heavily mineralized bone, their physiological development possessed a profound genetic plasticity. Cartilage can be rapidly warped, extended, and remodeled across successive generations through relatively minor genetic mutations, whereas true bone requires rigid, complex ossification pathways that inherently restrict drastic morphological shifts. This biochemical flexibility allowed the shark lineage to test every conceivable biomechanical hypothesis. The fossil record from this era yields creatures so anatomically bizarre that they challenge the fundamental parameters of marine biology. Consider the enigmatic Stethocanthus, a predator that prowled the Carboniferous reefs bearing a highly modified dorsal fin that resembled a massive, flattened anvil protruding from its back. This spine brush complex, exclusive to the males of the species, was densely covered in enlarged, spiked dermal denticles, mirroring a patch of similar tooth-like scales situated directly on top of its skull. For decades, the mechanical purpose of this bizarre structure baffled researchers. It severely compromised the creature's hydrodynamics, generating immense drag that would have made sustained, high-speed pursuit impossible. Biomechanical logic suggests that this anvil was not a weapon of war, but an elaborate biological billboard utilized for complex mating displays, or perhaps a localized sensory amplifier that manipulated water pressure waves to detect the minute movements of prey hiding within the complex reef structures. The morphological experimentation extended far beyond bizarre dorsal appendages, fundamentally altering the mechanics of the jaw itself. In a warm sea teeming with hard-shelled ammonites, trilobites, and massive nautiloids, a standard biting mechanism was insufficient. The evolutionary response was the development of nightmarish dental architectures, perfectly exemplified by the genus Edestis, widely known as the scissor-tooth shark. Unlike modern predators that continuously shed and replace their teeth in a rotating conveyor belt hidden within the gums, Edestis retained its older teeth, fusing them to the newer ones. This resulted in a single, monstrous row of serrated blades protruding far beyond the limits of its mouth, resembling massive pinking shears. To attack, Edestis did not employ a traditional clamping bite. Instead, it utilized a violent, vertical slashing motion, using its rigid, protruding tooth brackets to bludgeon and lacerate its prey, inflicting catastrophic trauma through sheer mechanical force. Yet, even the scissor tooth pales in comparison to the absolute pinnacle of Carboniferous biological eccentricity, Helicoprion. While technically extending into the subsequent periods, its evolutionary roots were deeply embedded in this era of bizarre radiation. Helicoprion possessed a lower jaw structure that defied all conventional logic of vertebrate anatomy, culminating in a highly specialized, tightly coiled spiral of teeth known as a tooth whorl. This biological circular saw was housed vertically within the lower mandible. Paleontological reconstructions and modern biomechanical modeling indicate that as the jaw closed, this spiral mechanism was mechanically forced backward, effectively slicing through the soft tissues and hard shells of ancient cephalopods with the precision of a rotary blade. The sheer diversity of these anatomical designs, from anvil-shaped dorsal fins to buzzsaw mandibles, proves that the Carboniferous Ocean was an immense, unforgiving laboratory. The shark lineage was aggressively testing the absolute limits of cartilaginous engineering, expanding into every available ecological niche, from top-tier pelagic hunters to highly specialized shell crushers. They had transformed from the weak, jawless underdogs of the primordial mud into a sprawling, dominant dynasty of morphological monsters, proving that extreme biological plasticity is a highly effective strategy in a stable, resource-abundant environment. However, this era of bizarre abundance and unchecked genetic mutation was built upon the fragile foundation of a highly specific global climate. The bizarre cartilaginous experiments that thrived in the warm, shallow, oxygen-rich seas were hyper-specialized for an environment that was temporary. The evolutionary ledger is ruthless, and the incredible biological diversity of the golden age of sharks was unknowingly marching toward an impending geological threshold. The intricate dental whorls and elaborate dorsal structures that defined their absolute dominance were about to be subjected to the most violent, unforgiving biological filter the planet had ever generated, forcing a brutal transition where only the most fundamentally efficient biological designs would survive the impending suffocation of the global oceans. The Permian period, which dragged to its horrifying zenith approximately 252 million years ago, witnessed the assembly of a geographical monstrosity, the supercontinent Pangaea. This colossal, uninterrupted landmass stretched from pole to pole, fundamentally disrupting global oceanic currents and generating a brutal, hypercontinental climate of extreme seasonal fluctuations. Along the vast, shallow margins of this unified continent, the descendants of the cartilaginous radiation continued to hunt, largely unaware that the terrestrial and subterranean forces of the planet were conspiring to orchestrate the single most devastating biological annihilation in the history of the Earth. This was not a localized disaster, nor was it a sudden celestial impact. It was a slow, agonizing, systemic failure of the entire global biosphere, an event so absolute and severe that paleontologists refer to it simply as the Great Dying. The highly specialized cartilaginous sharks, with their intricate dental whorls and elaborate dorsal structures, were about to be forcefully evicted from their ecological thrones. To comprehend the magnitude of this threat, one must analyze the precise geological trigger that initiated the collapse. Deep beneath the region now known as Siberia, an immense mantle plume, a colossal upwelling of superheated magma from near the planetary core violently breached the Earth crust. What followed was not a standard volcanic eruption, but an unimaginable geological hemorrhage. The Siberian traps erupted continuously for hundreds of thousands of years, covering over 2 million square kilometers of land in seas of boiling flood basalt thousands of feet deep. However, the lava itself was merely the localized physical mechanism of destruction. The true global apocalyptic weapon was entirely chemical. As the ascending magma tore through the continental crust, it ignited immense subterranean deposits of ancient coal, evaporates, and massive hydrocarbon reservoirs. This planetary-scale combustion forcefully ejected unimaginable quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and highly potent thermogenic methane directly into the atmosphere. The global climate, already destabilized by the monolithic presence of Pangaea, was violently thrust into a state of runaway greenhouse warming. Atmospheric temperatures spiked to levels utterly incompatible with complex biological processes. The sulfur dioxide mixed with atmospheric moisture to create continent-spanning deluges of concentrated sulfuric acid rain, stripping the terrestrial landscape of its vegetation and weathering exposed rock at an unprecedented, violent rate. This catastrophic chemical weathering washed millions of tons of raw sediment, toxic heavy metals, and hyper-concentrated terrestrial nutrients directly into the Panthalassic Ocean, the singular, massive body of water that surrounded the supercontinent. For the apex predators residing in the ocean, the nightmare was only just beginning, because the catastrophic atmospheric changes were rapidly translating into a total hydrological collapse. The first phase of the oceanic apocalypse was driven by the fundamental physics of gas solubility. As the global atmospheric temperatures skyrocketed, the surface waters of the ocean absorbed this immense thermal energy. Physics dictates that warm water holds significantly less dissolved oxygen than cold water. The superheated oceans rapidly lost their capacity to sustain the molecular oxygen required for complex aerobic respiration. Furthermore, the extreme surface temperatures effectively shut down the global thermohaline circulation. The massive deep ocean currents driven by the sinking of cold, dense, oxygen-rich surface waters at the poles. With no ice caps left to cool the water and drive this vital circulation, the ocean stagnated. The Panthalassic Ocean became heavily stratified, transforming into a colossal, motionless bathtub. Beneath the thin, boiling surface layer, the vast depths of the ocean were completely deprived of oxygen, creating a lethal condition known as global marine anoxia. For highly active marine predators, including the widespread lineages of early sharks, this rapid deoxygenation was a definitive death sentence. Their gills, engineered by millions of years of evolution to extract microscopic amounts of oxygen from passing water currents, became useless in a fluid medium that had been entirely stripped of its life-sustaining molecules. They were literally suffocating in an endless, inescapable expanse of water. Simultaneously, the immense volume of atmospheric carbon dioxide began to dissolve directly into the oceanic surface layers, reacting violently with water molecules to form carbonic acid. This process, known as massive ocean acidification, drastically lowered the hydrogen potential of the global seas. The intricate, mathematically precise chemistry required for marine organisms to extract calcium carbonate from the water to build shells and skeletons was completely shattered. The oceans became so intensely acidic that the protective shells of microscopic plankton, the rigid structures of massive reef complexes, and the heavy armor of bottom-dwelling invertebrates physically dissolved into the surrounding water. The physiological reality of navigating an acidifying, hypercapnic ocean is horrific. As carbon dioxide concentrations in the seawater reached unprecedented extremes, the gas inevitably diffused across the delicate epithelial tissues of the shark's gills, entering their bloodstreams. This triggered a condition known as severe hypercapnia, a radical drop in blood pH that aggressively disrupts the internal acid-base balance fundamentally required for basic cellular function. The highly specialized sharks of the era, accustomed to the oxygen-rich, chemically stable waters of the preceding epochs, possessed nervous systems and cardiac muscles that simply could not operate in this highly acidic internal environment. Their neurological pathways began to misfire, their sensory perception dulled, and their muscular coordination failed, leaving them disoriented, exhausted, and lethargic in an environment that demanded maximum physiological resilience. Furthermore, the base of the marine food web, which had sustained the incredible diversity of the cartilaginous predators for millions of years, entirely disintegrated. Without the foundational phytoplankton and the vast sheltering reef ecosystems, the intricate trophic pyramid collapsed inward. The specialized sharks that relied on crushing the shells of hard-bodied prey or hunting within the complex architecture of coral reefs suddenly found themselves occupying a dead, barren environment, completely devoid of any caloric input. Yet, the ultimate terror of the Permian extinction emerged from the darkest, oxygen-starved abysses of the stagnant ocean. In the completely anoxic depths, a sinister biological shift occurred. Organisms that required oxygen died, and their decomposing organic matter rained down to the sea floor, providing an infinite food source for a very specific type of ancient microorganism: anaerobic sulfate-reducing bacteria. Thriving in the absolute absence of oxygen, these bacteria metabolize the decaying biomass and the immense influx of terrestrial sulfur, excreting lethal hydrogen sulfide gas as a metabolic byproduct. This process, known as oceanic euxenia, saturated the stagnant depths with a highly toxic chemical compound. Slowly, inexorably, this purple, poisonous cloud of hydrogen sulfide rose from the abyss, breaching the oceanic surface and venting directly into the atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide is highly lethal to all aerobic life. It viciously attacks the respiratory system, blocking the ability of cells to utilize oxygen at a mitochondrial level. As this toxic gas bubbled into the shallow epicontinental seas, it systematically eradicated the remaining pockets of marine life. It also ascended into the stratosphere, where it chemically dismantled the Earth's protective ozone layer, allowing deadly, unshielded ultraviolet radiation to bombard the planet's surface, mutating the cellular DNA of the few surviving organisms. The combination of extreme thermal stress, severe ocean acidification, total marine anoxia, and the lethal upwelling of hydrogen sulfide created a perfect, inescapable biological storm. The oceans literally turned into a hot, acidic, toxic, and suffocating soup. The extinction rate was statistically incomprehensible. An estimated 96% of all marine species were completely wiped from existence, their genetic legacies permanently severed from the evolutionary tree. The sprawling, bizarre dynasty of the Carboniferous sharks was absolutely decimated. The highly specialized morphological monsters, the apex hunters that required immense amounts of oxygen to fuel their active lifestyles, and the bizarre shell crushers all fell victim to the collapsing food web and the toxic waters. The biological laboratory of the previous epochs was forcefully shut down, its most elaborate creations systematically discarded by a planet that had become actively hostile to life. The surviving cartilaginous lineage was brutally pruned, reduced to an incredibly narrow genetic bottleneck. They were violently stripped of their dominance, pushed to the absolute ragged edge of extinction, and forced to navigate a dead, purple ocean choked with the rotting remnants of a world that had seemingly ended. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of the great dying dictates that survival through this gauntlet could not possibly rely on dominance, physical strength, or elaborate weaponry. The few cartilaginous shadows that navigated this apocalyptic wasteland were forced to rely on a fundamentally different set of biological mechanisms, relying on microscopic secrets hidden deep within their physiological architecture that allowed them to cheat the absolute certainty of global death. To exist within a completely collapsing biosphere, an organism must entirely divorce itself from the volatile surface environment that is actively tearing itself apart. The surviving cartilaginous lineages, cornered by boiling sea surface temperatures, lethal ultraviolet radiation, and toxic atmospheric fallout, executed a profound ecological retreat. They abandoned the sunlit epipelagic zones, diving into the crushing, lightless abysses of the continental slopes and deep ocean trenches, while the vast majority of the oceanic depths had transformed into a stagnant, purple graveyard choked with hydrogen sulfide. There existed isolated, highly specific micro-refuges. Cold seeps, deep underwater currents, and narrow margins of the twilight zone where temperatures remained stable provided a razor-thin margin of safety. However, surviving the physical migration to these abyssal zones was merely the first biological hurdle. The deep ocean is an environment defined by absolute caloric deprivation. With the total collapse of the photosynthetic phytoplankton at the surface, the biological pump that normally sent a steady rain of organic nutrients down to the deep sea had virtually ceased. The surviving sharks were forced to navigate a pitch-black, freezing environment where food was statistically non-existent. To overcome this absolute famine, they relied upon an internal biological engine uniquely suited for prolonged starvation, an immensely specialized liver. Unlike bony fishes, which utilize a highly vascularized, gas-filled swim bladder to control their buoyancy, sharks maintain their position in the water column using an entirely chemical mechanism. The shark liver is an organ of unprecedented proportion, frequently occupying up to 30% of the entire total body mass of the animal. This massive biological reservoir is saturated with a highly specialized, low-density hydrocarbon oil known as squalene. Because squalene possesses a specific gravity significantly lower than that of surrounding seawater, it provides perfect neutral buoyancy without the mechanical risk of a gas bladder, which would fatally rupture or collapse under the extreme hydrostatic pressures of the deep ocean. More importantly, this colossal hepatic oil reserve served as an internal, long-term biological battery. In an environment completely devoid of prey, the shark could intentionally suppress its own metabolic rate, entering a state of extreme physiological depression. Their heart rate slowed to a fraction of their normal rhythm. Their bodily movements became agonizingly deliberate to conserve muscular energy, and their digestive tracts lay dormant. For months, or potentially even years, a prehistoric shark could sustain its essential neurological and respiratory functions by slowly metabolizing the immense lipid reserves stored within its liver. They transformed from active, aggressive predators into suspended, living ghosts, requiring almost nothing from a dead world while patiently waiting out the global chemical storm. Yet, the physical environment of the Permian extinction was not merely starving them, it was actively attempting to dissolve them. The massive influx of dissolved carbon dioxide had severely lowered the hydrogen potential of the global oceans, creating a highly acidic environment that rapidly degraded biological tissues. Furthermore, the chaotic fluctuations in oceanic salinity caused by massive evaporation and terrestrial runoff threatened to induce fatal osmotic shock, violently pulling water out of the cellular structures of marine organisms. To survive this chemical warfare, the cartilaginous lineage perfected a bizarre and highly toxic internal osmoregulatory defense mechanism. Bony fishes constantly expend massive amounts of metabolic energy, actively pumping sodium and chloride ions out of their gills to maintain cellular hydration against the pulling force of the salty ocean. The shark lineage, however, adopted a radically different, counterintuitive chemical strategy. They intentionally saturated their own internal tissues and bloodstream with massive concentrations of urea, a highly toxic nitrogenous waste product normally excreted rapidly by other vertebrates. By flooding their cellular environment with urea, the sharks artificially raised the internal osmotic pressure of their own bodies to match or slightly exceed the salinity of the surrounding ocean. This isotonic equilibrium prevented the surrounding acidic seawater from drawing out their internal hydration, eliminating the need to expend precious calories on active salt regulation. However, urea is inherently destructive to proteins, capable of unraveling the complex molecular structures required for life. To counteract this internal toxicity, the shark simultaneously synthesized and accumulated a secondary organic compound known as trimethylamine oxide. This specific chemical acts as a biological stabilizer, binding to the delicate cellular proteins and protecting them from the degrading effects of the urea. This microscopic, highly delicate balance of toxic waste and protective chemical stabilizers acted as a sophisticated internal shield, allowing the biological machinery of the shark to function flawlessly even as the external ocean became a hostile, highly acidic chemical bath. Armed with a slow metabolism and a chemically fortified internal environment, the surviving sharks still face the ultimate challenge of locating the sparse, hidden remnants of life buried within the deep, toxic mud. In this murky, heavily stratified ocean, traditional sensory inputs were utterly useless. The absolute darkness of the abyss rendered eyes completely obsolete. Furthermore, the extreme acidification of the water physically altered the molecular structure of organic compounds, severely disrupting the dispersion of odor plumes and rendering their highly advanced olfactory systems unreliable. To hunt an animal that is hiding beneath layers of silt in complete darkness, an organism must possess a sensory mechanism that can penetrate physical matter and ignore the chemical chaos of the water. The evolutionary answer was the refinement of one of the most terrifyingly effective sensory arrays in the history of vertebrate biology: electroreception. Scattered across the snout and the ventral surface of the shark's head are hundreds of microscopic pores that resemble the dark speckling of a shadow. These pores lead directly into small, flask-shaped anatomical structures known as the ampullae of Lorenzini. These biological receptors are connected by a complex network of elongated subdermal canals. Inside these canals lies a highly specialized, extraordinarily conductive mucopolysaccharide jelly. This internal biological gel is a masterpiece of natural engineering, possessing a significantly lower electrical resistance than the surrounding seawater, effectively acting as a highly efficient biological semiconductor. At the base of each ampulla lies a cluster of extremely sensitive sensory cells, directly wired to the central nervous system. This entire apparatus functions as a living, three-dimensional voltmeter, capable of detecting voltage gradients infinitesimally small, down to mere billionths of a volt. The application of this sense is devastatingly absolute. Every living organism generates a faint, continuous bioelectric field. Whenever a fish flares its gills to breathe, whenever a buried crustacean twitches its antenna, or whenever the heart muscle of a dying invertebrate contracts, sodium and potassium ions rapidly exchange across cellular membranes, generating a weak electrical signature. In the pitch-black, suffocating depths of the Permian oceans, a starving shark did not need to see its prey, nor did it need to smell the blood in the water. As it slowly swept its head just inches above the ocean floor, the conductive jelly within its snout captured the faint electrical static of a hidden, buried heartbeat. The electrical signal traveled rapidly down the canals, stimulating the sensory cells and mapping the exact three-dimensional location of the hidden organism directly into the shark's brain. The prey was completely unaware of its detection until the very moment the cartilaginous jaws plunged into the sediment, extracting the hidden calories with terrifying precision. This sixth sense granted the surviving cartilaginous lineage an insurmountable advantage. They became the ultimate, inescapable scavengers of the deep. They could locate dying organisms, decaying biological matter, and the few surviving detritivores entirely hidden from all other biological competitors. The mass extinction event systematically eradicated the highly specialized, bizarre morphological monsters of the Carboniferous period, completely stripping away the intricate dental whorls and elaborate dorsal structures that required immense metabolic upkeep. Those extreme genetic branches withered and died in the toxic shallows. The creatures that ultimately crawled out of the suffocating darkness of the Permian apocalypse were fundamentally different. They were genetically stripped down to an incredibly robust, generalized anatomical baseline. They were highly efficient, low-energy survivors possessing a chemically fortified internal architecture, a massive energetic reservoir safely contained within their buoyant livers, and a sensory grid capable of detecting the unseen electrical pulse of life itself. They had been subjected to a planetary crucible that destroyed 96% of all marine species, and they emerged not as weakened, fragile remnants, but as hyper-adapted, perfectly tuned survival machines. The catastrophic elimination of virtually all other marine competitors meant that as the Earth slowly stabilized, the descendants of these deep-water scavengers possessed an entirely blank evolutionary canvas. The global oceans were completely devoid of apex predators, setting a silent, ominous stage for the cartilaginous lineage to begin a relentless, unprecedented upward climb through the oceanic trophic levels, a biological resurgence that would soon pit them against entirely new, massive reptilian leviathans that were about to claim the warming surface waters of the Mesozoic era. The agonizingly slow biological recovery that followed the Permian apocalypse eventually blossomed into the Triassic period, an era defined by a fragile, newly assembled oceanic ecosystem slowly repopulating the shallow continental shelves. However, planetary stability is an illusion, and approximately 201 million years ago, the biological ledger was violently erased for a fourth time during the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction. The colossal supercontinent of Pangaea, the monolithic landmass that had dictated the global climate for millions of years, began to physically tear itself apart under immense tectonic strain. This massive continental rifting tore open a vast network of volcanic fissures known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, triggering an unprecedented outpouring of flood basalts that rapidly divided the landmass and birthed the rudimentary Atlantic Ocean. The geological violence of this separation injected catastrophic volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide directly into the atmosphere, initiating a lethal sequence of rapid global warming, severe ocean acidification, and widespread marine anoxia that mirrored the horrors of the previous extinction. Approximately 76% of all marine and terrestrial life was systematically extinguished, including the heavily calcified reef-building organisms and numerous lineages of massive, armored marine reptiles that had begun to dominate the coastal waters. Yet, the deep-water cartilaginous survivors of the Permian disaster, already metabolically adapted to localized oxygen deprivation and armed with their internal chemical stabilizers, navigated this fourth planetary gauntlet with chilling efficiency. As the toxic atmospheric fallout slowly settled and the oceanic chemistry rebalanced, these highly resilient predators ascended from the abyssal zones into a radically altered marine landscape. The Jurassic Ocean that awaited them was vastly different from the slow, heavily armored ecosystems of the past. It was an environment increasingly populated by the early ancestors of modern teleost fishes, highly agile, fast-moving organisms equipped with lightweight bony skeletons and complex swim bladders. To exploit this new, hyper-evasive food source and reclaim the apex predatory niches, the primitive, slow-moving scavenging anatomy of the ancestral sharks required a massive biomechanical overhaul. The evolutionary response to this new, fast-paced biological theater was not an increase in sheer size, but a series of precise, microscopic anatomical refinements that fundamentally altered their fluid dynamics and striking capabilities. The most critical upgrade involved a radical redesign of their propulsion system, culminating in the perfection of the heterocircle tail. Unlike the symmetrical, vertically aligned tail fins of most modern bony fishes, which are designed for continuous, highly efficient cruising, the cartilaginous tail became profoundly asymmetrical. The vertebral column of the shark did not terminate at the base of the tail. Instead, it aggressively extended upward, completely penetrating and supporting the elongated upper lobe of the caudal fin. This specific architectural asymmetry is a masterpiece of hydrodynamic engineering. In a fluid medium that is 800 times denser than air, propulsion is a complex equation of thrust, drag, and lift. Because cartilaginous sharks lack the internal gas-filled swim bladders of their bony competitors, their dense bodies naturally sink. The elongated upper lobe of the heterocercal tail, acting in concert with the stiff, wing-like pectoral fins, generates a highly specific downward thrust during active swimming, effectively pushing the anterior section of the shark upward and maintaining dynamic lift in the water column. More importantly, this asymmetrical structure functions as an incredibly powerful biological spring. When the massive lateral muscles of the torso contract, the kinetic energy travels down the spine and is concentrated entirely into the stiffened upper lobe, providing an explosive, multi-directional burst of speed that perfectly counters the evasive maneuvers of highly agile prey. This sudden, violent acceleration allows the predator to close the critical distance between itself and its target in a fraction of a second, transforming it from a slow, methodical scavenger into a devastating ambush hunter. Yet, raw acceleration is mechanically useless if the predatory organism cannot physically capture and retain a rapidly fleeing target. To solve this biomechanical problem, the cartilaginous lineage entirely dismantled and rebuilt the structural architecture of its own skull. In primitive fishes and early ancestral sharks, the upper jaw, known as the palatoquadrate, was firmly fused or tightly bound to the massive cartilaginous brain case, severely limiting the range of motion to a simple, hinge-like opening and closing mechanism. This primitive anatomical arrangement, known as amphistylic suspension, required the predator to physically ram its entire head into the prey to secure a bite, a highly inefficient strategy when hunting fast, slippery targets. The biological solution was a profound evolutionary leap known as hyostylic jaw suspension. Over millions of years of microscopic genetic adjustments, the upper jaw entirely detached from the cranium. Instead of a rigid fusion, the entire jaw apparatus became suspended beneath the skull by an intricate, highly elastic network of ligaments and a highly modified cartilaginous strut known as the hyomandibular cartilage. This radical detachment effectively decoupled the jaw from the structural limitations of the head. When a modern shark initiates a strike, it does not merely bite. It unleashes a complex, multi-stage mechanical sequence. As the snout violently lifts upward, the hyomandibular cartilage swings aggressively forward on its ligamentous hinges, mechanically projecting the entire upper and lower jaw assembly several inches out of the mouth cavity. This terrifying anatomical protrusion serves a dual, devastating purpose. First, it physically extends the lethal reach of the predator, allowing the serrated teeth to make contact with the prey before the massive bulk of the head hydrodynamically pushes the water and the prey away. Second, and infinitely more lethal, this sudden, violent forward projection of the jaw instantly and drastically expands the internal volume of the oral cavity. According to the fundamental principles of fluid dynamics, a rapid increase in volume within a closed underwater space generates an immense, instantaneous drop in internal water pressure. This negative pressure differential creates a massive, localized vacuum directly in front of the mouth. The surrounding water, carrying the fleeing prey, is violently sucked backward directly into the waiting lattice of razor-sharp teeth. The hyostylic jaw did not merely improve the bite, it weaponized the very physics of the surrounding water, transforming the mouth from a static, mechanical trap into an active, protruding vacuum chamber that could actively inhale highly evasive targets. The combination of the explosive, asymmetrical thrust generated by the heterocercal tail and the terrifying vacuum-inducing protrusion of the hyostylic jaw completely redefined the predatory capabilities of the lineage. They had evolved from the slow, benthic mud dwellers of the Paleozoic into highly tuned, hydrodynamically perfect biological missiles. This radical transition from passive survivors enduring extreme planetary trauma to aggressive, high-speed ambush hunters was absolutely critical for their continued existence. The Jurassic oceans were rapidly becoming a violently contested biological battleground, an arena where these newly refined cartilaginous hunters would immediately be forced to measure their sophisticated anatomical upgrades against an entirely new, unimaginably terrifying class of adversaries. The dinosaurs had conquered the continents, but a completely different lineage of massive, air-breathing reptilian leviathans was aggressively invading the global oceans, initiating a brutal, millions of years long biological arms race that would push the perfected anatomy of the shark to its absolute physiological limits. The Mesozoic era, spanning the expansive geological epochs of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, transformed the global oceans into a biological coliseum of unprecedented violence. While the early sharks had successfully navigated the apocalyptic extinctions of the Paleozoic and meticulously refined their ambush mechanics, they now found themselves sharing the pelagic zones with an entirely new, terrifying class of biological titans. The marine reptiles had arrived. These organisms were not fish, but highly advanced, air-breathing terrestrial vertebrates that had completely reverse-engineered their evolutionary trajectory, abandoning the continental landmasses to aggressively reclaim the marine environment. Lineages such as the plesiosaurs, armed with their deceptive serpentine necks and highly efficient four-flipper propulsion systems, and the later mosasaurs, colossal aquatic squamates equipped with massive, double-hinged jaws and crushing bite forces, brought a terrifying high-energy metabolism into the water. Because they breathed atmospheric air and possessed gigantothermic physiological systems, these reptilian leviathans were not bound by the dissolved oxygen limitations that strictly regulated the size and stamina of fully aquatic, gill-breathing organisms. They were massive, highly intelligent, visual predators that rapidly monopolized the apex positions of the oceanic food web, turning the shallow epicontinental seas into highly contested hunting grounds. To survive alongside these reptilian dreadnoughts, the cartilaginous lineage was forced into a profound biological arms race, triggering the emergence of the Neoselacians, the direct anatomical blueprints of all modern sharks. This transition required far more than mere behavioral adaptation. It demanded a fundamental structural fortification of their internal architecture. The elegant, highly flexible cartilaginous skeleton that had saved their ancestors from the metabolic starvation of the Devonian and Permian periods now presented a distinct mechanical limitation when competing against massive, bone-crushing reptiles capable of explosive bursts of speed. Pure cartilage, while remarkably lightweight, is inherently highly elastic. When a massive, fast-moving predator requires violent acceleration, its massive lateral torso muscles must forcefully contract against a solid, unyielding biological anchor. If the internal skeletal framework is too flexible, the kinetic energy generated by the muscular contraction is absorbed and lost in the bending of the skeleton itself, severely dampening the overall thrust and forward velocity. True bone provides this essential rigid anchor, but returning to a heavy, fully ossified skeleton would completely erase the metabolic and buoyant advantages the sharks had perfected over hundreds of millions of years. The Neo-Salacian solution to this biomechanical paradox stands as one of the most sophisticated examples of structural engineering in the natural world. Instead of replacing the cartilage with solid bone, they reinforced it on a microscopic level. Deep within the vertebral column, specialized cells began to deposit dense, highly mineralized calcium salts in a highly specific mathematical pattern. These microscopic hexagonal blocks of calcified tissue, known to modern science as tesserae, formed a tightly interlocking, mosaic-like armor directly over the soft cartilaginous core of each individual vertebra. This architectural masterpiece, known as tessellated calcified cartilage, provided the exact structural rigidity of solid bone without the massive energy-draining weight penalty. These calcified asterospondylus vertebrae acted as unyielding biological fulcrums, allowing the sharks to anchor immense blocks of highly vascularized red muscle for sustained cruising and dense white muscle for explosive, high-velocity strikes. This internal fortification granted the Neo-Salacians the sheer mechanical horsepower required to physically outmaneuver the massive marine reptiles, allowing them to rapidly close distances to steal prey or violently evade the crushing jaws of a territorial pliosaur. Yet, physical speed was merely one component of their overarching survival strategy. The marine reptiles were predominantly visual hunters, possessing enormous eyes perfectly adapted to detect movement and silhouette through the murky sunlit layers of the shallow seas. Engaging such formidable adversaries in a direct, head-to-head physical confrontation was mathematically suicidal for the cartilaginous hunters. To dominate an environment ruled by visual giants, the Neo-Salacians completely weaponized a fundamentally different sensory modality, turning the very chemistry of the ocean into an inescapable tracking network. They initiated a massive evolutionary expansion of their neurological architecture, specifically enlarging the olfactory bulbs, effectively dedicating an unprecedented volume of their total brain mass entirely to the rapid processing of chemical signals. The anatomy of the shark snout was subsequently redesigned not for respiration, but for absolute chemical interception. The nostrils, or nares, are completely disconnected from the respiratory system, situated ventrally beneath the wide cartilaginous snout. As the shark propels itself forward through the water column, fluid is violently forced into these specialized cavities, passing over a highly convoluted, accordion-like structure of sensory tissue known as the olfactory rosette. This intricate, highly folded architecture exponentially increases the cellular surface area exposed to the water, allowing millions of highly sensitive receptor cells to constantly analyze the molecular composition of the ocean. This biological system is so mathematically perfect that a neo-Salacian could detect a single drop of amino acids, the fundamental chemical building blocks of blood and decaying tissue, heavily diluted within millions of gallons of seawater. Furthermore, because the nares are positioned on opposite sides of the wide cartilaginous snout, the shark possesses the terrifying ability of stereo-olfaction. When a chemical plume of blood drifts through the ocean current, it strikes one nostril mere fractions of a second before the other, creating a microscopic temporal and concentration differential. The massive olfactory computer within the shark brain instantly analyzes this minute discrepancy, calculating the exact spatial trajectory, distance, and origin of the chemical source with geometric precision. This staggering sensory capability completely altered the ecological dynamic between the sharks and the giant reptiles. The neo-Salacians did not need to physically overpower a colossal mosasaur. They simply utilized the massive reptiles as biological engines of opportunity. When a mosasaur violently ambushed a massive prey item, the resulting trauma released a massive plume of blood and organic lipids into the water column. Miles away, completely hidden within the dark, sensory void, the neo-Salacian olfactory network would immediately intercept the chemical signal. Guided by their stereo-olfaction, propelled by their newly calcified vertebral columns, and fine-tuning their final approach using the electrical detection of their ampullae of Lorenzini, the sharks would silently arrive at the kill site with terrifying speed. Utilizing their protrusible, hyostylic jaws, they could aggressively strip massive chunks of flesh from the carcass, effectively stealing the caloric reward, or even target the injured mosasaur itself, before vanishing back into the deep water before the massive reptile could effectively retaliate. They became the ultimate inescapable opportunists, a highly mobilized hypersensory cleanup crew that thrived on the chaotic violence generated by the apex reptiles. The biological ledger of the Mesozoic era proves that sheer size and brute force are highly effective, yet ultimately brittle evolutionary strategies. The marine reptiles ruled the oceans through undeniable physical supremacy, but their dominance was loud, energy-intensive, and entirely dependent on a stable, calorie-rich environment to fuel their massive warm-blooded bodies. The sharks, meanwhile, operated in the unseen chemical margins. By perfecting a skeletal structure that seamlessly merged the lightness of cartilage with the rigid strength of bone, and by wiring their advanced neurology into the very chemical fabric of the ocean, the neo-Salacians engineered a mode of existence that was incredibly robust. They were no longer merely surviving in the shadows of giants. They were actively exploiting them, extracting a constant biological taxation from the kills of the leviathans. They were patiently refining a predatory architecture that would soon be called upon to navigate yet another planetary apocalypse, a celestial event that would violently erase the magnificent, invincible reptiles from the earth forever, and leave the perfectly tuned cartilaginous hunters to inherit the silent, darkened oceans. The absolute biological supremacy of the giant marine reptiles was violently terminated approximately 66 million years ago. not by a superior biological competitor, but by a blind mathematical intersection of celestial mechanics. An asteroid measuring roughly 10 kilometers in diameter, traveling at an estimated hypervelocity of 45,000 miles per hour, slammed into the shallow carbonate platform of the Yucatan Peninsula. The kinetic energy released by this impact, known as the Chicxulub event, was mathematically equivalent to billions of atomic bombs detonating simultaneously. The immediate physical consequences were apocalyptic. Mega tsunamis towering hundreds of feet high completely obliterated coastal ecosystems, while a massive thermal pulse radiating from the impact zone instantly incinerated vast swaths of terrestrial life. However, the true global killer was not the localized kinetic blast, but the ensuing atmospheric contamination. The asteroid struck a geological region heavily saturated with anhydrite and gypsum, vaporizing billions of tons of rock and violently injecting an immense volume of pulverized silicate dust, soot, and sulfur dioxide directly into the stratosphere. This dense planetary shroud of ejecta completely enveloped the globe, rapidly plunging the Earth into a prolonged freezing darkness known as an impact winter. Sunlight, the fundamental radiation that powers the intricate biological engine of the planet, was physically severed from the surface of the global oceans. In this sudden, terrifying twilight, the foundational pillar of the marine food web suffered a total and immediate collapse. Phytoplankton, the microscopic solar engines that required constant ultraviolet radiation to photosynthesize and replicate, died entirely. The cessation of phytoplankton production triggered a catastrophic vertical starvation event that rippled upward through the trophic levels with devastating velocity. The zooplankton starved, followed rapidly by the highly specialized ammonites and the massive schools of schooling fish. For the colossal marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and the plesiosaurs, this sudden absence of prey was a thermodynamic death sentence. These reptilian leviathans were biological engines of immense power, utilizing endothermic or highly advanced gigantothermic physiologies to maintain elevated, stable internal body temperatures in the cold ocean waters. This warm-blooded advantage granted them explosive speed, rapid digestion, and massive physical strength, but it came with a highly inflexible, astronomical metabolic cost. A 60-foot mosasaur required a massive, uninterrupted daily influx of high-density calories merely to sustain its own cellular function and prevent its massive body from succumbing to hypothermia. When the global food web disintegrated, their immense size transformed instantly from an evolutionary advantage into a fatal physiological liability. Furthermore, their evolutionary heritage as terrestrial tetrapods contained a critical flaw. They were fundamentally bound to the surface to breathe atmospheric air. As they frantically searched a dying, empty ocean for vanishing prey, they were repeatedly forced to break the surface, directly exposing their respiratory systems to freezing atmospheric temperatures, highly toxic sulfuric acid rain, and skies choked with abrasive silicate dust. Exhausted, freezing, and suffocating, the invincible titans of the Cretaceous period simply ran out of fuel. Their massive hearts stopped, their lungs flooded, and their colossal armored bodies slowly lost buoyancy, sinking silently into the crushing darkness of the abyssal plains. The Neo-Selacians, however, possessed a physiological architecture perfectly engineered to survive a dark, starving world. As the surface oceans turned toxic and chaotic, the cartilaginous lineage executed a rapid, vertical retreat into the deep bathypelagic zones. Unlike the advanced bony fishes, which risked fatal internal rupture of their gas-filled swim bladders during rapid depth changes, the sharks relied entirely on their massive, squalene-filled livers for static buoyancy. This incompressible hydrocarbon oil allowed them to plunge hundreds of fathoms into the stable, cold, unaffected depths of the ocean without suffering barotrauma. In this pitch-black abyss, they were completely shielded from the violent thermal fluctuations and the toxic atmospheric fallout ravaging the surface layers. Yet, they still face the universal threat of the total global famine. Survival in the aftermath of the Chicxulub impact required an organism to entirely abandon the role of the apex hunter and embrace the macabre, highly efficient role of the ultimate oceanic scavenger. The mass death of the marine reptiles and the larger pelagic fishes created an unprecedented, massive biological windfall on the ocean floor. Millions of tons of necrotic tissue, representing the fallen apex predators of the previous era, rained down into the deep sea. To locate these isolated, massive biological energy reserves in absolute crushing darkness, the sharks deployed their hyper-advanced sensory grid. Vision was completely useless, but the deep ocean currents carried the microscopic chemical signatures of decaying fat and rotting protein. The sharks' heavily convoluted olfactory rosettes and specialized stereo-olfaction calculated the precise chemical gradients in the pitch-black water, allowing them to track the invisible odor plumes over vast distances directly to the fallen carcasses. As they closed in on the localized kill sites, their ampullae of Lorenzini detected the faint, residual bioelectric breakdown of cellular tissues, guiding their protrusible jaws directly to the most calorie-dense sections of the dead leviathans. Consuming massive quantities of rotting flesh, heavily saturated with lethal putrefactive bacteria, would be instantly fatal to most marine organisms, but the internal digestive chemistry of the shark had been relentlessly perfected over hundreds of millions of years. Their stomachs function as highly specialized biological vats, maintaining a localized pH level so highly acidic that it borders on the strength of industrial battery acid. This extreme internal acidity instantly neutralized deadly bacterial pathogens, rapidly dissolved heavy reptilian bone matrices, and broke down complex rotting proteins into raw, usable caloric energy. Furthermore, the sharks did not need to feed constantly. After aggressively gorging on the fallen mosasaurs, a shark could rapidly convert the massive influx of protein and fat into stable squalene lipids, storing the excess energy directly within its massive liver. Once the biological battery was fully charged, the shark could intentionally downregulate its metabolic rate to an absolute minimum, entering a state of lethargic, deep-sea conservation. They could survive for months, or potentially over a year, in the freezing darkness without requiring another meal, patiently burning through their internal oil reserves while the planet above them continued to burn and freeze. The fifth mass extinction systematically eradicated the massive, energy-intensive reptilian overlords, permanently clearing the pelagic zones of their sheer brute force. The asteroid did not destroy the sharks. Ironically, it converted their greatest biological competitors into an immense, localized food source that sustained the cartilaginous lineage through the most severe starvation event in planetary history. By stripping away their reliance on constant hunting, utilizing their chemically fortified digestive tracts to process necrotic waste, and relying on the incredible metabolic flexibility of their cartilaginous anatomy, the sharks proved once again that ultimate evolutionary resilience is not measured by the capacity to dominate a thriving ecosystem, but by the terrifying ability to consume the dead and quietly outlast the apocalypse in the dark. As the suffocating impact winter of the Paleogene period slowly dissolved, the planetary shroud of silicate dust finally settled, and sunlight once again pierced the surface of the global oceans. The colossal marine reptiles, the air-breathing leviathans that had monopolized the sunlit pelagic zones for tens of millions of years, were completely eradicated, reduced to calcified fossils buried deep within the abyssal silt. Nature, however, inherently abhors an ecological vacuum. The cartilaginous scavengers, having survived the most severe starvation event in planetary history by metabolizing the rotting carcasses of their former oppressors in the freezing darkness, began a slow, inexorable ascent back into the light. They entered a newly illuminated, rapidly recovering marine environment, completely devoid of apex predators. This nascent Cenozoic era marked the final, terrifying chapter in their evolutionary saga, an epoch where the descendants of the primordial mud would not merely adapt to survive, but meticulously engineer themselves into the absolute, flawless pinnacle of biological lethality. The warming, highly productive oceans soon witnessed the emergence of a completely new, calorie-dense biological resource: marine mammals. The early terrestrial ancestors of whales and seals began to colonize the seas, offering massive, slow-moving packages of high-energy blubber. To exploit this unprecedented caloric goldmine, a specific branch of the cartilaginous family tree initiated a staggering escalation in sheer physical dimensions, giving rise to the infamous megatooth lineage. Beginning with massive predators like Otodus obliquus, this genetic trajectory culminated in the absolute biological terror of Otodus megalodon. Reaching lengths exceeding 50 feet and weighing over 50 tons, Megalodon was not merely a large fish. It was a highly specialized biomechanical whale-killing machine. To hunt animals heavily insulated by feet of dense, fibrous blubber and protected by thick cages of mammalian bone, the ancient mechanism of the cartilaginous jaw underwent a devastating modification. Their teeth completely transitioned from the grasping, awl-like structures of their Paleozoic ancestors into massive, highly robust triangular blades equipped with microscopic, mathematically uniform serrations. These serrated edges functioned identically to a macroscopic industrial saw, allowing the predator to violently shear through massive blocks of mammalian tissue and bone with a single, catastrophic lateral shake of its head. Biomechanical modeling of the Megalodon jaw reveals a bite force exponentially greater than that of any terrestrial dinosaur, generating a crushing hydraulic pressure designed to instantly rupture the vital organs of a massive whale, inducing immediate hydrostatic shock and fatal exsanguination. Yet, the true zenith of cartilaginous evolution was not achieved through sheer, unsustainable gigantism. When the global climate eventually shifted, freezing the polar oceans and driving the whale populations into icy waters where the cold-blooded Megalodon could not follow. The massive megatooth lineage collapsed into extinction, proving once again that absolute size is an evolutionary trap. Instead, another, far more insidious branch of the shark family tree was silently perfecting an entirely different survival algorithm. The lamnid sharks, the direct genetic precursors to the modern great white, abandoned the brute force approach of massive size in favor of profound physiological manipulation. They achieved a biological miracle previously thought entirely exclusive to highly advanced mammals and birds. They learned to manipulate their own internal thermodynamics. Sharks, fundamentally, are ectothermic organisms, meaning their internal body temperature is dictated by the surrounding water. In the freezing depths of the ocean, cold muscle tissue contracts agonizingly slowly, and neurological processing is severely delayed. To overcome this paralyzing thermal limitation and hunt fast-moving, warm-blooded marine mammals in freezing waters, the great white shark engineered a microscopic internal cardiovascular heating system known as the rete mirabile, translated from Latin as the wonderful net. This highly complex, dense web of microscopic veins and arteries acts as an incredibly efficient countercurrent heat exchanger. As the massive, deep red bands of muscle running along the shark's torso forcefully contract during active swimming, they generate a significant amount of metabolic friction and heat. Instead of allowing this precious thermal energy to dissipate harmlessly into the freezing ocean as the blood cycles through the gills for oxygenation, the rete mirabile captures the heat. It physically transfers the thermal energy directly from the warm venous blood returning to the heart into the cold arterial blood freshly oxygenated from the gills. This localized thermal recycling allows the modern apex shark to maintain a core body temperature significantly higher than the surrounding seawater, a physiological phenomenon classified as regional endothermy. This unseen internal fire fundamentally alters the physical capabilities of the predator. Warm muscle tissue contracts with explosive, terrifying velocity, granting the shark the ability to execute violent, high-speed vertical breaches from the freezing depths to ambush highly evasive seals at the surface. More importantly, this highly specialized vascular network aggressively shunts warm, oxygen-rich blood directly into the brain cavity and the massive orbital capsules housing the eyes. A heated brain processes neurological data at a drastically accelerated rate, while warm retinal cells possess a dramatically faster flicker fusion frequency. This allows the shark to visually track highly agile, rapidly fleeing prey with the absolute precision of a high-speed camera, even in freezing murky water. The prey is severely handicapped by the freezing temperatures, operating in a state of thermal deceleration, while the shark attacks with the neurological and muscular speed of a warm-blooded predator trapped within a hydrodynamically perfect, cold-blooded chassis. This thermal advantage is seamlessly integrated into their archaic, highly perfected sensory array, creating a biological supercomputer capable of processing multiple streams of environmental data simultaneously. Long before a prey item is ever seen, its presence is detected miles away by the highly folded olfactory rosettes, instantly processing the microscopic chemical signatures of fat, blood, and fear heavily diluted in the ocean current. As the shark silently closes the distance, a deeply ancient hydrodynamic feature comes into play. The primitive placoid scales that served as rigid armor for their Ordovician ancestors have been microscopically refined over 400 million years into perfectly streamlined, overlapping dermal denticles. These microscopic tooth-like structures are intricately grooved to channel water seamlessly over the predator's body, drastically reducing hydrodynamic drag and completely silencing the acoustic signature of its movement. The shark approaches with absolute acoustic stealth, effectively becoming an invisible fluid dynamic ghost. When the visual threshold is finally crossed, the lateral line system, a highly sensitive network of fluid-filled canals running along its flanks, detects the microscopic, low-frequency pressure waves generated by the frantic swimming motions of the target, mapping the exact trajectory of the prey in real time. Finally, in the absolute chaotic violence of the terminal strike, when the massive hyostylic jaw dislocates, protrudes, and expands to violently inhale the prey, the shark completely rolls its eyes backward into its skull to protect its delicate retinas from thrashing claws and teeth. In this momentary, self-induced blindness, the predator does not miss. The ampullae of Lorenzini, the ancient bioelectric sensors perfected during the suffocating darkness of the Permian apocalypse, take complete autonomous control. They instantly detect the panicked, firing electrical synapses of the prey's dying heart and the frantic contracting of its muscles, guiding the protruded, serrated jaws directly to the exact geometric center of the living target with terrifying, inescapable precision. The biological entity that currently patrols the modern oceans is not a primitive relic, nor is it merely an evolutionary leftover. It is a highly compressed, living database of planetary survival. Every microscopic dermal denticle, every calcified hexagonal plate deposited within its vertebral column, and every invisible electrical receptor hidden within its snout was violently forged in the fires of global annihilation and painstakingly refined through hundreds of millions of years of merciless biological warfare. They have optimized fluid dynamics to a level that modern naval engineering still struggles to fully replicate. They have weaponized the fundamental chemistry of the ocean, turning toxic waste products into internal life-saving shields, and manipulating their own vascular networks to violently cheat the thermal laws of the deep sea. They represent the absolute optimization of predatory architecture, an incredibly robust, generalized biological machine that possesses the terrifying ability to rapidly adapt to the complete collapse of a global food web, outlast the agonizing starvation of the abyss, and patiently rise again to violently reclaim the absolute apex of the oceanic hierarchy. The evolutionary journey from a toothless, mud-dwelling filter feeder to the ultimate Cenozoic hunting machine is complete, leaving behind a creature that is terrifyingly flawless and perfectly prepared for whatever catastrophic disaster the planet might conjure next. To observe a modern shark gliding silently through the water column is to look directly into a living, biological time machine. Their anatomical architecture is not merely an accumulation of random genetic mutations. It is a meticulously curated archive of planetary trauma. Every microscopic dermal denticle, every strand of highly elastic cartilage, and every sensory pore wired into their nervous system was forged in the crucibles of global annihilation. They stand as the definitive biological answer to the most extreme environments the Earth could generate. When the Ordovician oceans froze, they survived by requiring almost nothing. When the Devonian seas suffocated, their lightweight skeletons allowed them to outlast heavily armored titans. When the Permian apocalypse turned the oceans into a toxic, acidic, hydrogen sulfide wasteland, they retreated into the abyssal darkness, chemically shielding their internal organs and relying on bioelectric sensors to hunt in absolute blackness. When the Chicxulub asteroid blocked out the sun and starved the giant reptilian leviathans, the cartilaginous lineage patiently consumed the fallen ruins of that lost world. They have repeatedly proven that ultimate biological success does not belong to the largest, the most heavily armored, or the most voracious. True evolutionary resilience is found in the shadows, in the profound ability to minimize energy consumption, rapidly adapt sensory processing, and exploit the devastating ecological vacuums left behind when dominant species inevitably collapse. They are the silent, eternal regulators of the marine ecosystem, outlasting 4 separate mass extinction events over 450 million years. Yet, this magnificent, seemingly invincible biological paradigm is currently facing a catastrophic vulnerability. The evolutionary strategies that perfected the shark were entirely governed by geological time. Natural mass extinctions, even those triggered by sudden asteroid impacts, unfold over thousands or millions of years, providing a narrow temporal window for metabolic downregulation and gradual genetic shifts. Today, however, the oceans are experiencing an extinction event of a fundamentally different nature, driven not by tectonic rifting or celestial mechanics, but by the relentless, industrialized expansion of a single terrestrial species. The bipedal primate, a very recent addition to the planetary biosphere, has completely bypassed biological evolution through technological acceleration. Human beings do not compete with sharks using claws, jaws, or muscle. They harvest the oceans using massive, mechanized trawlers, miles of synthetic gill nets, and sophisticated sonar arrays that strip the seas of biomass with absolute mathematical efficiency. This hyper-accelerated industrial extraction directly exploits the very physiological traits that saved the shark in the past. To survive global starvation events, sharks evolved an extremely slow metabolic rate, which corresponds directly to late sexual maturity, extended gestation periods, and incredibly small litter sizes. In a natural, stable ocean, this slow reproductive strategy is perfectly balanced, ensuring that the apex predator population does not exhaust its own food supply. Against the unyielding mathematics of modern industrial fishing, this slow reproductive rate is an absolute, unavoidable death sentence. They are being forcefully removed from the global oceans millions of times faster than their biological engines can possibly replace them. The profound irony of this historical intersection is difficult to overstate. A biological masterpiece that successfully navigated boiling oceans, sulfuric acid rain, and the total collapse of the global food web is currently being systematically eradicated for the momentary economic value of a bowl of soup and the incidental bycatch of industrialized agriculture. Furthermore, the rapid chemical alteration of the modern oceans by human activity mirrors the terrifying conditions of the deep past. Anthropogenic carbon emissions are once again driving rapid ocean acidification and expanding hypoxic dead zones. We are artificially recreating the exact apocalyptic parameters of the Permian and Triassic extinctions, but at a velocity completely unprecedented in the geological record. The cartilaginous lineage has survived these chemical horrors before, but never while simultaneously facing the absolute physical depletion of their populations by an apex industrial harvester. Paleontological data clearly indicates that whenever an apex predator is abruptly removed from an ecosystem, the trophic cascade that follows is violent, chaotic, and utterly devastating to the underlying biological networks. As the oldest and most effective biological regulators of the oceans are pushed to the absolute brink of total systemic collapse. We are forced into a deeply uncomfortable position of geological observation. We are watching the potential final act of a 450 million year epic unfold in real time. The ultimate question that remains is not whether the oceans will survive without their ancient cartilaginous guardians. The Earth has proven it will continually reset and repurpose the remnants of any devastation. The haunting uncertainty is whether the bipedal primate that engineered this unprecedented, high-speed biological collapse can possibly survive the cascading ecological consequences of an ocean permanently stripped of its oldest, most perfected living machines. If the ultimate survivors of 4 global apocalypses cannot withstand the Anthropocene, what chance does a fragile, newly evolved species of hominid truly have?